Dr. Kempner is an associate professor of sociology at Rutgers University, where she writes, teaches, and lectures about the science, medicine, politics, gender, and the body. Her award-winning book, Not Tonight: Migraine and the Politics of Gender and Health, uses concepts from sociology, anthropology, literature, history, and science studies. That's a lot. That's amazing. To explain why so few people take migraine seriously, despite the fact that it is one of the most common painful and disabling disorders in the world. Dr. Kempner is also known for her work on the politics of controversial science. Her research can be read in a wide range of academic and popular venues. She'll speak to us today on the topic, the social life of migraine. Please welcome me in joining and welcoming Dr. Kempner.
Hi, everyone. It is such an honor to be here. Thank you, Shirley, for inviting me, and thank you, Miles for Migraine, for holding this event. I'm hoping this is the first of many productive migraine education days. I think it's such a great idea, and I'm glad to see so many people here today. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the title of my talk, which might seem a little unusual and maybe a little bit perverse to talk about migraine as having a social life, since most of us know migraine is a thief of social lives. So why does migraine get to go out and drink red wine while we're laying in a dark bed? It's not what I mean by migraine having a social life at all. What I really want to talk about here today is migraine as not just being a biological entity. We just heard this really wonderful talk about migraine as biological and migraine as medical, and migraine having what causes migraine and how migraine happens in the body. And all of that is, and how to treat migraine, and all of that is really important to understand for making us feel better. But what I really want to emphasize today is that in order to make lives better for people with migraine, we also have to think about migraine as a social entity. And migraine is profoundly social. And that means that in order to make our lives better, we have to address migraine as social. We have to think about potential solutions in ways that are social. So I started to learn this lesson myself when I was just a little girl. I'm the one in this picture who does not look like she's having a headache. I'm actually this one over here. And I started getting my headaches when I was just about 5. And a pediatrician, this is according to my parents who remember this better than I do, a pediatrician diagnosed me as having a type A personality. And this is, I guess, 1980. And they told my parents that there was nothing that they could do other than tell me to relax. My mom has always had headaches and migraines as well. I remember her being in bed for days when I was a little girl. And she rejected this. So she took me to every doctor and healer that she could think of, trying to get me better. So my childhood, what I remember about my childhood, even more than being in pain, is just going to like doctor after doctor after doctor and constantly being told a lot of cockamamie explanations for why I was in pain. Usually that I was stressed. And then I had to relax. One of my favorite was around when I was 17. A doctor told me that maybe I was worried I didn't have a boyfriend yet. And one of my personal favorites was that I just needed to breathe more. And mindful, we're going to do some, I think there's going to be some talk about mindfulness meditation today, and that is a great way to cope with pain, but that can seem a little dismissive when you haven't even gotten a diagnosis yet. So I started to wonder whether or not everybody just thought I was a hypochondriac. I felt like this Victorian lady here. Nobody could explain why something as banal and common as a headache was keeping me in bed all day. And when I think back on that time, it wasn't really the chronic pain that bothered me so much as it was this feeling of shame, that maybe I was just weak and I couldn't handle the kinds of pain that other people had all the time. So I felt like this for years, and as I lived my life, I decided eventually I was going to go get my PhD in sociology, and I was not thinking about studying medicine, but when I got there, I realized that there was this field called medical sociology in which scholars had been studying something called stigma. Now, stigma is an idea emerges in the 1960s in sociology, and it's the idea that there are social and individual attributes or behaviors that are devalued or discredited in particular social contexts. And in medical sociology, we talk about different ways diseases can be stigmatized. So diseases can be stigmatized certainly if they're contagious. So if somebody has the flu, you're like, get away from me. That's stigma. So we talk about stigma in terms of social distance. We can also stigmatize diseases when we think people are personally responsible for the onset of their disease. So lung cancer is a stigmatized disease, whether or not people smoked, because we assume people smoked. Similarly, hepatitis B carries a stigma because it's associated with sexual transmission. We also stigmatize diseases when they're associated with body parts that we don't like to talk about. So we talk about a lot about different kinds of cancer, but you don't hear a lot of news stories about anal cancer. That's a body part people don't like to talk about. Also, we stigmatize disorders that affect the mind. Schizophrenia, for example. That's a disorder that it gets hidden and shrouded a lot. And this isn't, I don't mean to give an exhaustive list of all the factors that lead to stigma, but we also stigmatize disorders, and I think this is really important in migraine. We stigmatize disorders when they're associated with groups that are already marginalized. And a really classic example of that is HIV/AIDS. If you think back to the 1980s, there was no government response and very low public response to the issue of AIDS until we had Ryan White diagnosed with AIDS. And so we started to think about AIDS as something that happened to people who were not gay. So I started in graduate school wondering how stigma might affect migraine. I started to put it together. Oh, I feel this way because migraine is stigmatized. And I wanted to learn more about it. So migraine, we all know, is an invisible disorder, and it's impossible to measure in any objective way. And that means that the legitimacy of migraine depends very much on the person who's reporting the symptoms. We have to believe them. And that means that, and let me just say, in case you don't know, the majority of people who have migraine are women. Although migraine is so prevalent, something like 9 million American men have migraine. But we tend to associate migraine with women. And so all of these qualities about migraine, plus the fact that migraine tends to be thought of as a women's disorder, make migraine really vulnerable to stigma. Here we go. So I went and studied migraine, and I studied migraine in a variety of settings. In medical settings, I studied the pharmaceutical industry, I studied people who had migraine, I looked on the internet, on internet forums for migraine, and I found I was not the only person who felt this way about migraine. This is a quote from Terry Robert. Some of you may know her as a great migraine advocate. And one of the things she says is that if you visit our message boards any day, you'll find posts from people whose main problem with migraine care is attitude. Not theirs, but that of some medical professionals, some media, and much of the general public. And when I went into the boards she was talking about, I found that one of the biggest problems facing people with migraine was stigma. When I talked to people with migraine, that's what people with migraine wanted to talk about. They wanted to say to me that they were worried other people thought that they were, quote, nuts, stressed out, drug-addled, and unreliable. That's what people with migraine worried about. And this is a concern that goes back in time. I just think Joan Didion is so cool, so I have to put in a slide about her. But Joan Didion wrote this famous essay about her own migraines, and she talks about this as well. All of us who have migraine suffer not only from the attacks themselves, but from this common conviction that we are perversely refusing to cure ourselves by taking a couple of aspirin, that we are making ourselves sick, and that we bring it on ourselves. So just through a show of hands, how many of you can relate to this feeling that migraine isn't taken seriously? So quite a few of you. And I want to say that this idea, this general feeling that we have, comes from a sociocultural context that we really need to pick apart and untangle and understand. And that context has a history that is long and is tangled and is deeply embedded into our culture. And it's not as easy to fix as just educating people. We can't just go out there and say, that's not what migraine is, because culture is more complicated than that. And so these ideas are also deeply embedded into our institutions. And so that's what I want to spend the rest of my talk discussing. I want to talk about how these ideas about, when these ideas about migraine emerged, how they circulate in our culture, how they're entangled in our institutions, why they're so persistent, and then talk a bit about what we can, as a community, do about them. So migraine's a really old diagnosis in the medical literature. It goes back millennia. And for a long time it was, right, this does bounce. Sorry about that. I won't mind if you guys close your eyes, if it's bothering you, I won't take it personally. It was taken seriously. But this idea about migraine starts to change in the 18th century. And that in the 18th century, and I'm talking about the West here, I'm talking about Britain and particularly Britain, I'm focused on Britain and France. There is this idea emerges that migraine affects a particular kind of person. And I'm going to talk about this idea, how this idea emerges in culture first. This is an image illustrating a very famous poem called The Rape of the Lock, a poem written by Alexander Pope. And the woman reclining here is Belinda. She's the protagonist. And in this scene, she has suffering from a number of ailments of the spleen, one of which is a migraine. She's laying pensive in bed because she's mourning the loss of a piece of her hair that was cut against her will by a baron. And I think this is a classic illustration of a privileged woman who feels too weak to emerge from bed because of a relatively small issue, in this case, a bad haircut. The cultural references to migraine and migraine in this case continue throughout the centuries. Another classic some of you might remember is from Little Women, Louise and May Alcott's classic. Beth is the most sensitive and the sickliest of the characters, and she also is the one who always gets headaches. And I don't want to ruin this story for anybody who hasn't seen it, but Beth dies. This idea of the sickly but sensitive person who gets headaches comes from an idea in medicine that also comes out in the early 18th century called the nervous temperament. The nervous temperament is articulated by a famous English doctor, George Chaney, who argues that in the new modern world, modern in the 18th century sense, there are certain people who have this nervous temperament, and they are what he called invariably of good breeding, meaning they're upper class. They're what they called high sensibility, which means that they are artistic, creative, witty people. They're quick, imaginative thinkers, and they're intellectuals. But the problem with this kind of personality or this kind of way of being is that it comes with a bunch of nervous disorders, like hysteria, hypochondria, or the vapors. I hate the vapors. Okay, the reason he argued was biological, and so the nervous temperament is actually about having nerves that are too lax, feeble, or unelastic, and that breeds pathology. Now, if you are a fan of Jane Austen, you'll recognize this nervous temperament in the character of Marianne from Sense and Sensibility. And you'll remember her, she loves art and music, and she thinks that's really important in her suitor, but she walks through the rain and then almost dies. So that's the classic nervous temperament. The nervous temperament gets attached directly to migraine in the 19th century. And I give just this example of P.W. Latham because he is a very, very influential writer on migraine. And he talks about migraine as people possessing what is called the nervous temperament here. Their brains are very excitable, their senses acute, and their imagination's free. So if you have migraine, you have both positive attributes and negative attributes. And I also illustrated this with a picture of a schoolboy because I wanted to point out and really make clear that this person with migraine can be male or female. They're always upper class. It's an upper class disorder. And it's about using your brain in ways that are because you're thinking too hard, or if you're a woman because you're thinking in the wrong, you just shouldn't really be thinking. Now this really comes to the fore in the 20th century. Now you would think in the 20th century, with the emergence of scientific medicine, that some of this would go away. But in the turn of the 20th century, thinkers like Freud and behaviorists like Pavlov and Adolf Meyer are ascendant. You know, people are really impressed by them, and people and medical doctors are very, very interested in mind-body relationships. This is a picture of Harold G. Wolfe. He's considered the father of modern headache medicine, in large part because he brings science to headache medicine. And this is a picture of him in his laboratory. What I want to talk about with him is that not only does he bring science into headache medicine, one of the things he does is he doesn't actually get rid of these ideas about who a person with migraine is. His science kind of amplifies it. I'll just start with his science. He is really innovative in the way he develops experiments about migraine. He's famous too. He's super famous. This is a picture from Life magazine. And it's one of his contraptions in which he uses to measure vascular changes in migraine. So he's one of the first people to really show that there are physiological changes with migraine, which is really important in demonstrating the realness of migraine. But he's also really taken by psychosomatic medicine and behaviorists with whom he trained. And he thinks that even though migraine is real and biological, he thinks it's brought on by personalities. So he's actually the person who is the inventor of the infamous migraine personality. And the way he describes it is that the migraine personality is the individual with migraine aims to gain approval by doing more than and better than his fellows through application and hard work, and to gain security by holding to a stable environment. Now, I have to tell you two things about Harold Wolfe. First of all, he had migraines. So in a way, you can see how he's describing himself here. And almost all the researchers who studied migraine through time had migraines themselves. That's an interesting thing about people who study migraines. The other thing is that his clinic is on the Upper East Side, so he has a very well-to-do clientele. So he's also describing his patients. One of his most prescribed treatments was actually a squash game. So that's the kind of patient he's used to dealing with. This comes through also in the popular press when they talk about his migraine personality. So we're not really seeing that neurotic woman here yet. Right now we're seeing the type A, organizational man, hard worker. Here's the aspirin eater, high pressure big shot who lives, breathes, eats, drinks, sleeps, and dreams his unbridled ambition, right? So where then is this neurotic woman that we associate with migraine? Well, she comes up when Harold Wolfe and his peers talk about the migraine personality in reference to women. They're using their brains, but in ways that you would imagine a woman would use her brains. And that is to worry about things she should not be fretting about. And so here I use his colleague Walter Alvarez. Walter Alvarez is a gastroenterologist, very big in migraine at the time. Gastroenterologists were in the game then because when you have migraine, you throw up a lot, so then you go see your gastroenterologist. But what he says, this is one thing he says, it is an axiom with me that whenever a woman is having 3 attacks of migraine a week, it means that she is either psychopathic or else she is overworking or worrying or fretting or otherwise using her brain wrongly. And I accompanied this with this is an ad from the journal Headache, the official journal of what was then called the American Association of, I think it's Headache Science, I can't remember now. And this is an actual ad, and you can see they portray the migraine patient as a Victorian lady. Alvarez goes on to say a number of things that are crazy, but one of the things he says that if one of the exciting causes of the attacks is marital infelicity and much thinking about divorce, he says that he could almost cure the disease by getting the woman to see clearly that she isn't tough enough or heartless or unkind enough to go ahead and getting the divorce she craves. So that's how women get talked about with migraine. And you can also see this in headache advertisements at the time. And this advertisement, as you can see, this is for Anacin. You can see this woman is really suffering under the burdens of ironing, cooking, doing the groceries, and taking care of her kids. And I feel her because that's how I look when I'm doing that. But then she takes some Anacin and look, as Alvarez says, once he has a talk with patients, he says when she stops thinking about it, she stops having headaches and gets as well as she can be. Of their husbands, he would tell them, you had to have an angel to put up with all your illnesses, and you got him. Oh, he's a marriage counselor. Okay, now these depictions of migraine all seem ridiculous and silly until we start comparing them to contemporary images of migraine. Okay, now we just heard this great talk about how migraine is about the brain and it's neurobiological, and we would like to think that this is enough to destigmatize migraine. But of course I'm going to argue it's not because I'm a sociologist. Okay, so I am going to pick on Carolyn Bernstein's otherwise very good book, very informative book about migraine, because she talks about the migraine brain in a way that I think really illustrates why talking about migraine as a brain disorder can sometimes fall short of destigmatizing migraine. And what she says is, in this one passage, your brain is as high maintenance as they come. Like a thoroughbred racehorse or diva, it's a hypersensitive, demanding, and overly excitable. It usually insists that everything in its environment remains stable and even-keeled. It can respond angrily to anything it isn't accustomed to or doesn't like. A migraine brain is always on alert, ready to overreact to any stimulus it finds displeasing. Now, what strikes me about this description is that it sounds actually, to my ears, a lot like the migraine personality. But it's the migraine personality ascribed to a brain. Now, does that do any cultural work for us? Well, yes. I mean, somehow having a personality, you feel responsible for your personality. Like, you could change your bad personality, and you can't really change out your brain easily yet. But you could, but then you're stuck with a brain. If your brain has all of these bad characteristics, well, that doesn't make you any more pleasant to be around. So that's kind of a problem. The other thing is the descriptors of this brain are highly gendered, so you wouldn't necessarily want to you might describe a man as a thoroughbred racehorse, but a thoroughbred racehorse is known as being a bit fragile in a way, and a diva is a very kind of highly feminine word. So there's something going on here in this description that isn't necessarily going to remove the stigma of migraine. It also reads a lot like this 19th century description of the migraine, of the nervous temperament, when we talk about people who have migraine as having excitable brains, acute senses, and free imaginations. So I don't see a lot of progress in the way that we're talking about the brains of people with migraine. Now, what happens when we leave the realm of medicine and go into popular culture? Well, this is actually an old Imitrex ad. This comes from maybe like 15 years ago, 14 years ago. And this is but I like it because this is an ad. I think we can recognize the picture of the woman holding her head. But there are a few things I want to say about it. She's not just working any job. This is a nurse, and she's not taking care of like some chunky, strong man. She's taking care of tiny babies in a NICU. And she's not really taking care of them with her migraine. She's turned her back to them. So she is, she has a migraine and she can't do her job. And we can all relate to that. I can't do my job when I have a migraine, at least not very well. But she can't care for them. She's incapable of caring. And the room's kind of dark and gloomy. Now, in the ad, there's a series of pictures in this ad. She takes her medication and she feels better, which is great. And the room brightens up and is sunny, and she is capable again of nurture. And she's holding the baby, and like life is good again. And this is a cultural narrative that we see with in pharmaceutical advertisements quite a bit. That medicine restores you so that you're capable of taking care of not just your work roles, but also your social roles. In this case, a highly gendered social role. And what strikes me about this advertisement is it's actually not that far off from this advertisement. She can't take care of her gendered roles, which are about care and nurture. She takes her medicine, and she can. So I don't know if that makes me a crazy sociologist, that I see these as the same, but I do. I see a lot of similarities in those narratives. Now, the other thing about migraine is that we also see these as jokes. Headache gets entrenched as jokes and as a metaphor in cultural in popular culture. And so, in this case, headache becomes code for something that's like irritating or annoying, maybe potentially catastrophic to your presidential administration, but not a disorder, right? So it becomes a metaphor for something that we don't necessarily have to treat that seriously, and also the punchline for a joke. And so we have this way of thinking about headaches and migraines that isn't just that serious. Now, why does this stigma matter? Okay, it matters for so many reasons. First, it harms individuals with migraine, and as I saw a lot of you raised your hands, and I think that you are going to know what it feels like. I'm guessing a lot of you know what it feels like when people aren't taking your migraine seriously, and how damaging that can be to your sense of self. I know Dr. Young will be speaking about this in much greater detail later today, so I'll just leave that there. It can also make it really difficult to be a good employee. I mean, it can be unless you have an understanding employer, understanding workplace, a flexible workplace. It can be hard to keep a job if you have chronic migraine. And it can also be, stigma makes it also really hard to apply successfully for long-term disability. Because people don't necessarily think about migraine as a disability, even though we know it's super disabling. So stigma is then what we call institutionalized into our systems of employment, into our systems of disability insurance. Okay, so stigma also reduces our possibilities for seeking and receiving good health care. So when migraine is stigmatized, it may make us less likely to seek help, and that may that our desire to seek help or our willingness to seek help may vary depending on race, gender, and class too. So when we see all of those advertisements of women in pain, white privileged women in pain, that may make us think that, that may make men think that maybe they don't have migraine. That may reduce we already know men don't seek help at the same rates as women. Maybe men aren't going to recognize their pain as migraine and go seek help as much. It also doesn't help doctors see migraine as something that's very serious and something that needs to be treated well. And on that note, we've really seen how the stigma of migraine is institutionalized in medical schools and in neurology departments. So, and this is also true of pain more broadly. So there have been a lot of calls to increase training around pain education in undergraduate medical curriculum. There's almost no training for migraine in the undergraduate medical programs, even though migraine is one of the most common disorders that doctors see. And many neurology departments don't have a dedicated headache specialist on staff and don't see the need for a dedicated headache specialist on staff. And we can trace this to a pervasive sense that migraine is not an important disorder to treat. Stigma also reduces the number of board-certified headache specialists that are available to treat migraine. And this is in large part because doctors don't want to treat migraine patients because they see migraine as an uninteresting disorder to treat, and they perceive people with migraine as being whiny. I've heard this over and over again from physicians. So that stereotype of people with migraine as being neurotic and whiny, it gets institutionalized within the healthcare profession in that way. And then I think possibly most importantly, the stigma significantly decreases the amount of federal funding allocated to headache research. And I have this chart here. This is not the first time today, the only time today you'll see this chart. This chart, what is it's showing you is on the x-axis, you will see how much burden diseases create based on a measure called disability-adjusted life years. And on the y-axis, it's how much money the NIH allocates to those diseases. And so a number of diseases are plotted out on this graph. The red line is what you would project, how much money you would predict a disease would get based on the amount of burden that disease produces. So if a disease falls on that red line, it is receiving about as much money as you would expect it to get based on its burden to our economy and to its burden based on this disability measure. So you can see from this chart that I have a red dot. That's what you can see. Epilepsy, schizophrenia, they're right on your regression line, right? They're right exactly where you would expect them to be. You can see depression is pretty close, just a little lower than you would expect. And then you can see some diseases are doing super well, way better than you would predict. HIV/AIDS, getting way more money than you would think it should based on burden. And cancer is doing way better than you would think it should. But look at who is doing very poorly. Look at who's almost off the chart. Poor migraine. Migraine is not doing well at all. Yep, okay, you're not raising your hand. Okay, so, and that is because, and we know this from sociological studies about how diseases get on public agendas, that this is a form of institutionalized stigma. This is because policymakers and legislators do not think that migraine is significant enough to receive funding, despite objective measures that migraine ought to be getting funding. Okay, what can we do about this? One thing I think is the obvious thing to do is to look at diseases that have been very successful at advocacy. And breast cancer is in some ways an obvious model, in other ways an outlier because it's been so successful. But when you look at this image, would you guess that 35 years ago it was embarrassing to tell somebody that you had breast cancer? And now people are celebrating breast cancer survivors. So 35, 40 years ago, you wouldn't even say the word, your doctor wouldn't say the word cancer to you. They would say the big C. They would talk about something else. They would use euphemisms. And now, now we have football players wearing pink for breast cancer. How did that shift happen? That's what we need to know. And the quick and dirty answer is through advocacy. And this is where the social matters so much in migraine, because nothing's going to happen unless we get our acts together, right? And so that is my message for you. My message is that we as a heady community, we have to be the change that we want to see. This is a great start. We have to empower each other to speak out about how migraine affects us. Because it's scary to do that. When there's that much stigma about migraine, it's scary to get out there and say how this affects our lives. But if we do that, we're going to empower the next person and the next person. So I'm so encouraged by the crowd here today. I think that is the great way to build this community, and we're going to be able to change the face of migraine. So let's keep that momentum going, because stigma and stereotypes, they may be one of the greatest challenges facing us. But it's a challenge that we can overcome if we work together. And we've seen that happen for other diseases, and we can do that here. Thank you very much.